The humid August air clung to Margaret Whitmore's skin like a damp burial shroud as she navigating through the crowded estate sale on Bull Street. Spanish moss draped from the ancient live oaks created natural curtains that filtered the harsh Georgia sunlight into something more tolerable, though the oppressive heat remained unchanged. The antebellum mansion before her stood like a monument to better times, its Greek revival columns weathered but still proud despite the decay that had begun to claim its edges. Margaret adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and pressed a handkerchief to her neck, absorbing the perspiration that seemed to flow endlessly in Savannah's unforgiving climate. As a historian specializing in Civil War memorabilia, she had attended dozens of these sales over the past decade, searching for artifacts that could help her piece together the complex tapestry of the South's most turbulent period. The Blackwood estate promised to be particularly fruitful, given the family's prominent role in Savannah's pre-war society. She moved methodically through the rooms, her trained eye scanning past the obvious treasures that other collectors were already claiming. Crystal chandeliers, mahogany furniture, and silver tea services held little interest for her. Margaret sought the personal items, the forgotten photographs and letters that revealed the human stories behind the grand facades of Southern aristocracy. In the library, dust motes danced in shafts of golden light that streamed through tall windows. The air here felt different somehow, heavier with the weight of accumulated years and unspoken secrets. Margaret's fingers traced along the spines of leather-bound volumes, many bearing the water stains and foxing that came with decades of Georgia's subtropical climate. It was then that she noticed the small wooden box tucked behind a set of Shakespeare's complete works. The box itself was unremarkable, fashioned from pine with simple brass hinges that had tarnished to a dull green. But as Margaret lifted it from its hiding place, she felt an unexpected chill run down her spine despite the sweltering heat. The sensation was so sudden and intense that she nearly dropped the container, catching it against her chest with both hands. Inside, wrapped in faded burgundy velvet, lay a daguerreotype in an ornate silver frame. The image showed a child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, dressed in the formal attire typical of the 1860s. But it was the child's eyes that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. They were pale, almost colorless, and seemed to possess a depth that was both ancient and profoundly unsettling. The boy's expression was serene, yet there was something in his gaze that spoke of knowledge no child should possess. Margaret had examined thousands of Civil War-era photographs, but none had ever affected her quite like this one. The technical quality was exceptional for the period, with remarkable clarity and detail that brought the subject to life in an almost uncomfortable way. She could make out every strand of the child's fine, light-colored hair, every fold in his pristine white shirt, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be a faint luminescence around his figure that seemed to glow even in the daguerreotype's metallic surface. A handwritten label on the back of the frame identified the subject simply as Elijah Fox, 1863. Below that, in different handwriting that appeared more hurried and distressed, someone had scrawled, "God help us all." Margaret turned the photograph over in her hands, studying every detail with the meticulous attention that had made her reputation as a researcher. The frame bore the mark of Josiah Hartwell, a daguerreotypist known to have worked in Savannah during the war years. But there was something else, a small engraving along the bottom edge that she almost missed. Not even the church could explain that child, Rev. Samuel Morrison. The words sent another inexplicable chill through her body, and Margaret found herself looking over her shoulder as if someone might be watching. The library had grown quiet around her, the voices of other estate sale patrons seeming to fade into a distant murmur. Even the oppressive heat seemed to have retreated, leaving her surrounded by a pocket of cool air that raised goosebumps along her arms. She approached the elderly woman managing the sale, a distant Blackwood relative who had driven down from Atlanta to settle the estate. The woman, Mrs. Pemberton, looked tired and eager to be done with the entire affair. "Excuse me," Margaret said, holding up the daguerreotype. "I'd like to purchase this photograph." "Do you know anything about its history?" Mrs. Pemberton glanced at the image and immediately looked away, as if the sight of it disturbed her. "That old thing? It's been in the house for as long as anyone can remember. My great-aunt used to keep it hidden away in her bedroom, said it gave her nightmares. You can have it for $20 if you really want it." $20 was a fraction of what such a well-preserved daguerreotype should cost, but Margaret wasn't about to argue. She handed over the money quickly, as if afraid the woman might change her mind or realize the photograph's potential value. As Margaret walked back to her car, the wooden box tucked securely under her arm. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Several times she turned around, expecting to see someone behind her on the tree-lined sidewalk, but the street remained empty, save for the occasional passerby heading to or from the estate sale. The sensation persisted, even after she reached her vehicle, a persistent prickling at the back of her neck that suggested unseen eyes tracking her every movement. Margaret placed the box carefully on the passenger seat and started the engine, grateful for the blast of air conditioning that began to dispel the heat and her growing unease. It wasn't until she was halfway home to her own house in Savannah's historic district that she realized the temperature in her car had dropped to an almost uncomfortable level despite the blazing afternoon sun. She reached to adjust the air conditioning and found, to her confusion, that it had been turned off the entire time. Margaret's Victorian cottage on Jones Street welcomed her with its familiar embrace of polished hardwood floors and tall ceilings designed to combat the southern heat. Built in 1847, the house had served as her home and office for the past 8 years, its rooms filled with carefully catalogued artifacts from her Civil War research. The afternoon sunlight streamed through lace curtains, casting intricate shadows across her dining room table, which doubled as her primary workspace. She set the wooden box containing the daguerreotype on the table and stepped back, studying it from a distance. Even through the closed lid, she could feel the photograph's presence, like a weight in the room. The sensation was absurd, she told herself. After years of handling historical artifacts, she had never experienced anything remotely supernatural, and she wasn't about to start believing in such nonsense now. Yet as she moved through her evening routine of preparing dinner and organizing her notes from other recent acquisitions, Margaret found her eyes continually drawn back to the box. The simple pine container seemed to command attention in a way that defied rational explanation. By the time darkness fell over Savannah's tree-lined streets, she could no longer resist the urge to examine her purchase more closely. Margaret cleared her workspace and set up her photography equipment, intending to create detailed documentation of the daguerreotype for her research files. She opened the box with careful hands, lifting the silver-framed photograph into the circle of light cast by her desk lamp. Once again, the child's pale eyes seemed to look directly at her, and she had to remind herself that it was merely an optical illusion created by the photographer's skill. The technical quality of the image continued to impress her. Daguerreotypes from the 1860s were often marred by chemical stains or surface scratches, but this example appeared to have been preserved under ideal conditions. Every detail remained sharp and clear, from the intricate buttons on Elijah Fox's white shirt to the subtle texture of his fine hair. The mysterious luminescence she had noticed earlier was even more pronounced under her desk lamp, creating an ethereal quality that seemed to make the child's figure glow against the darker background. Margaret began her research by examining the frame itself. The silver had developed a natural patina consistent with its age, and the craftsmanship spoke to the skill of its maker. Josiah Hartwell had been one of Savannah's most prominent daguerreotypists during the Civil War period, known for his portraits of wealthy families and visiting dignitaries. She made a note to check the Historical Society's records for more information about his work and client list. The inscription attributed to Reverend Samuel Morrison proved more intriguing. Margaret had encountered Morrison's name in her previous research, though only in passing references to his role as pastor of one of Savannah's oldest Presbyterian churches. She pulled out her laptop and began searching through digitized church records and newspaper archives, looking for any mention of the Reverend in connection with unusual events or controversial statements. As she worked, the house around her settled into its familiar nighttime creaking and sighing. The old wooden beams expanded and contracted with the cooling temperatures, creating a symphony of soft sounds that normally served as a comforting backdrop to her evening research sessions. Tonight, however, every noise seemed amplified and somehow purposeful, as if the house itself was trying to communicate something important. Margaret's concentration was broken by the sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor above her head. Light, quick steps that moved from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other before falling silent. She looked up at the ceiling, frowning. She lived alone and had locked all the doors upon returning home. The logical explanation was that the old house was settling more dramatically than usual, perhaps due to the day's intense heat, followed by the evening's cooling. She returned to her research, finding several newspaper mentions of Reverend Morrison from the 1860s. Most were routine announcements of church services and community events, but one brief article from September 1863 caught her attention. The Savannah Daily Herald had published a small notice stating that Reverend Morrison had taken a temporary leave of absence from his pastoral duties due to matters of spiritual concern, requiring extended prayer and contemplation. The timing was significant. If Elijah Fox had died in 1863, as suggested by the date on the photograph, then Morrison's mysterious leave of absence occurred shortly afterward. Margaret made notes about the correlation and continued searching for more specific information about the child himself. The footsteps upstairs resumed, this time accompanied by what sounded like a child's laughter, soft and musical, but with an undertone that made Margaret's skin crawl. She stood up from her chair, listening intently. The laughter came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door opening and closing. Margaret grabbed a flashlight from her kitchen drawer and climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. The hallway stretched before her, illuminated by moonlight streaming through a window at the far end. She checked each room methodically, finding nothing out of place. The windows were all securely latched, and no signs of intrusion were evident anywhere. As she turned to head back downstairs, Margaret noticed that the temperature in the hallway had dropped considerably. Her breath was beginning to form small clouds in the suddenly frigid air, despite the fact that her air conditioning system wasn't powerful enough to create such a dramatic temperature change. The cold seemed to be emanating from the area directly above her dining room workspace. She hurried back downstairs, her flashlight beam dancing across the walls. The dining room appeared exactly as she had left it, with one notable exception. The daguerreotype, which she had positioned flat on the table under her desk lamp, now stood upright in its frame, angled as if to provide a better view of whoever might be sitting in her chair. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she approached the table. She was certain she had left the photograph lying flat, but perhaps she had unconsciously propped it up while examining the frame details. The human mind could play tricks, especially when dealing with unfamiliar objects in low lighting conditions. She repositioned the daguerreotype flat on the table and returned to her laptop, determined to continue her research despite the evening's strange occurrences. But as she scrolled through more historical records, Margaret became increasingly aware of a presence in the room with her. Not threatening exactly, but insistently there, like a child seeking attention from a distracted adult. The sensation grew stronger as the night progressed, accompanied by subtle changes in the room's atmosphere that she couldn't quite identify. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more profound, and the air itself felt charged with an energy that made her skin tingle. Margaret found herself glancing repeatedly at the daguerreotype, half expecting to see some change in the child's expression or posture. By midnight, she had compiled a substantial amount of information about both Josiah Hartwell and Reverend Morrison, but virtually nothing about Elijah Fox himself. The child appeared to have existed in a historical vacuum, leaving no trace in birth records, death certificates, or family documentation. For someone prominent enough to warrant a professional daguerreotype, the absence of any supporting documentation was highly unusual and deeply puzzling. Margaret woke to complete darkness, disoriented and cold. Her laptop had gone into sleep mode, and the desk lamp that had illuminated her workspace now cast only a dim glow that seemed insufficient to penetrate the thick shadows that had gathered in her dining room. She must have dozed off while researching, though she had no memory of growing tired. The digital clock on her laptop showed 3:17 a.m. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Margaret became aware of a soft humming sound coming from somewhere in the house. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a lullaby that seemed familiar yet impossible to place. It drifted through the rooms like smoke, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The voice carrying the tune was high and sweet, unmistakably that of a young child. Margaret sat very still in her chair, every nerve ending alert to the impossible situation unfolding around her. She lived alone. Her nearest neighbors were separated by thick garden walls, and she had locked every door and window before settling down to work. Yet the humming continued, growing slightly louder, as if the unseen child was moving closer to her location. The temperature in the room had dropped to an almost unbearable level. Margaret could see her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, and frost had begun to form on the surface of her water glass. The cold seemed to radiate outward from the daguerreotype itself, which lay where she had left it on the table, though its silver frame now gleamed with an inner light that had nothing to do with her desk lamp. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Margaret could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She reached for her flashlight with trembling hands, clicking it on to sweep the beam around the room. Everything appeared normal until the light fell across the daguerreotype, where she saw something that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. The child in the photograph had changed position. Where before Elijah Fox had been standing straight and still in the formal pose, typical of 1860s portraiture, he now appeared to be sitting, his pale hands folded in his lap, and his head tilted slightly to one side, as if listening to something only he could hear. His colorless eyes, which had previously gazed directly at the camera, were now focused on something beyond the frame's edge, something in Margaret's dining room. Margaret's rational mind desperately searched for explanations. Perhaps the change in lighting had created an optical illusion, or maybe she was experiencing the effects of extreme fatigue and stress. Daguerreotypes were known to shift appearance under different lighting conditions, and her emotional state could certainly be influencing her perception of the image. But even as she tried to rationalize what she was seeing, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that the photograph had changed. The child's new position was too dramatic, too specific to be explained by lighting tricks or wishful thinking. Something impossible was happening in her home, and the epicenter was the innocent-looking daguerreotype she had purchased just hours earlier. A soft footstep on the hardwood floor behind her made Margaret spin around in her chair, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to reveal nothing but empty space. Yet the sensation of being watched was overwhelming, as if invisible eyes were studying her every movement with intense curiosity. The air around her seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, though the room remained bitterly cold. Margaret forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady beneath her. She needed to get out of the room, to put distance between herself and the increasingly active daguerreotype. But as she took a step toward the doorway, a child's voice spoke from directly behind her, so close that she could feel warm breath against her neck. "Why did you take me from the dark place?" The words were spoken in a soft, cultured accent that belonged to another era, with the careful pronunciation of a well-educated child from the antebellum South. Margaret whirled around, her flashlight beam sweeping frantically across the empty space where the voice had originated. Nothing was there, yet the presence she felt was so strong it seemed to have physical weight. "Who are you?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. "I am Elijah Fox," came the reply, though this time the voice seemed to emanate from the direction of the daguerreotype, "and I have been waiting so very long for someone to find me." Margaret's beam returned to the photograph, where she saw that the child's position had changed again. Now he appeared to be standing once more, but turned to face outward from the frame as if he were looking directly at her. His pale eyes held an expression of profound sadness, mixed with something that might have been hope. "You're not real," Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. "This is just stress or a dream or—" "I am as real as sorrow," Elijah's voice interrupted gently. "As real as the loneliness that has consumed me for 60 years. As real as the questions that drove Reverend Morrison to abandon his pulpit and flee Savannah in the darkness of night." The mention of Morrison's name sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with the room's supernatural cold. Her research had confirmed that the Reverend had indeed left his position abruptly in 1863, but she had found no explanation for his sudden departure. Now, faced with the impossible reality of a speaking daguerreotype, those historical mysteries were taking on a terrifying new significance. "What happened to you?" Margaret asked, surprising herself with her willingness to engage with the apparition. "Why did you die?" "Die?" Elijah's laugh was soft, but tinged with a sadness that seemed too mature for his apparent age. "Dear lady, I never lived at all. That was the problem that so troubled the good Reverend. How does one explain a child who exists but has never drawn breath? How does the Church account for a soul that was never born?" Margaret's academic mind struggled to process the implications of what she was hearing. If Elijah was claiming to have never been alive in the traditional sense, then what exactly was he, and how had he come to be trapped within the daguerreotype? The questions multiplied in her thoughts, but before she could voice any of them, the presence in the room began to fade. The temperature slowly started to return to normal, and the unnatural luminescence surrounding the daguerreotype dimmed to its previous level. Elijah's voice came one more time, distant now, as if he were speaking from across a great chasm. "I cannot maintain this connection for long," he said. "The crossing between worlds requires more strength than I currently possess. But you have opened the door, Margaret Whitmore, and I am grateful. Soon I will have enough power to show you the truth of what happened in 1863 and why Reverend Morrison's faith was shattered beyond repair." The voice faded to nothing, leaving Margaret alone in her dining room with only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the distant hum of her refrigerator to break the silence. She looked down at the daguerreotype, which had returned to its original pose, showing Elijah Fox standing formally in his white shirt, his pale eyes once again focused on the camera rather than on her. But Margaret knew with absolute certainty that everything had changed. Whatever force had been dormant within the photograph for decades was now awake, and she had become an unwilling participant in a mystery that stretched back to the darkest days of the Civil War. Dawn broke over Savannah with the promise of another scorching August day, but Margaret barely noticed the golden light filtering through her lace curtains. She had spent the remaining hours before sunrise sitting in her kitchen, as far from the dining room as possible, clutching a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Every creak of the old house made her jump, and several times she had thought she heard that haunting lullaby drifting through the walls. By 8 o'clock, Margaret had made a decision. Whatever was happening with the daguerreotype, she needed answers rooted in historical fact rather than supernatural speculation. She gathered her research materials and laptop, carefully avoiding looking directly at the photograph, and headed for the Georgia Historical Society's research library on Whitaker Street. The familiar atmosphere of the archive provided some comfort. Here, surrounded by countless documents and artifacts from centuries past, Margaret felt more in control. She had spent hundreds of hours in these reading rooms, and the musty smell of old paper and leather bindings was as reassuring as a childhood blanket. She requested all available materials related to Reverend Samuel Morrison, Presbyterian church records from the 1860s, and any documentation of unusual deaths or disappearances in Savannah during 1863. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, was an old friend who had assisted Margaret with numerous research projects over the years. As she brought the requested materials, she paused with a concerned expression. "You look like you didn't sleep much last night," Mrs. Chen observed. "Are you feeling all right? You seem a bit shaken." Margaret managed a wan smile. "Just excited about a new research project. You know how I get when I'm on the trail of something interesting." Mrs. Chen nodded knowingly and left Margaret to her work, but not before mentioning that she would be available if Margaret needed any additional resources. The first box of materials contained routine church records, baptisms, marriages, and burial services conducted by Reverend Morrison between 1860 and 1863. His handwriting was precise and elegant, reflecting the careful education of a 19th-century clergyman. Most entries were unremarkable, documenting the normal cycle of life and death in a southern city during wartime. But as Margaret progressed through the documents, she began to notice subtle changes in Morrison's writing style and content. The early entries were confident and filled with conventional religious language about God's grace and divine providence. By mid-1863, however, his tone had shifted dramatically. References to trials of faith and questions that defy scriptural guidance began to appear with increasing frequency. One entry from July 1863 stopped Margaret cold. Written in Morrison's increasingly agitated handwriting, it read, "Consulted with Bishop Hartwell regarding the matter of the child who claims no earthly parentage. His Excellency counsels prayer and patience, but offers no guidance for a soul that exists outside the natural order of creation. How does one baptize that which was never born? How does one comfort that which has never known the warmth of a mother's love?" Margaret's hands trembled as she photographed the page with her phone. Bishop Hartwell was undoubtedly related to Josiah Hartwell, the daguerreotypist who had created Elijah's portrait. The connection between the religious and photographic communities in 1860s Savannah was becoming clearer, but the nature of Elijah himself remained frustratingly mysterious. Further entries revealed Morrison's growing desperation. In August 1863, he wrote, "The child continues to manifest at all hours, seeking understanding that I cannot provide. He speaks of loneliness that spans eternity, of existing in spaces between moments where time holds no meaning. Yesterday, Mrs. Pemberton found him in the church garden, sitting among the graves and conversing with shadows. When approached, he vanished like morning mist, leaving only the scent of flowers that bloom in no earthly soil." Margaret sat back in her chair, processing the implications of what she was reading. Mrs. Pemberton must have been an ancestor of the woman who had sold her the daguerreotype, creating another link between past and present. And Morrison's descriptions of Elijah's manifestations matched perfectly with her own experiences the previous night. The final entry in Morrison's hand was dated September 15, 1863. The writing was barely legible, scratched across the page with obvious haste and distress. "I can bear no more. The child's very existence challenges everything I have been taught to believe about the nature of God and creation. If souls can exist without birth, without the divine spark that kindles life in the womb, then what does this say about the fundamental order of existence? I am leaving Savannah tonight, before my faith is destroyed entirely. May God forgive me for abandoning those in my care, but I fear that continued exposure to this mystery will cost me not just my calling, but my sanity. I have arranged for Josiah Hartwell to create a permanent record of the child's appearance in hopes that future generations might find answers where I have found only questions." Margaret stared at the page long after she had finished reading. Morrison's final entry confirmed that the daguerreotype had been created as a deliberate record of Elijah's existence, not a casual portrait. The Reverend had fled Savannah specifically because of his encounters with the mysterious child, and his faith had been so shaken that he abandoned his calling entirely. The next box contained newspaper clippings and community records from the same period. Margaret found several brief mentions of Morrison's sudden departure, most describing it as a temporary leave due to personal spiritual matters. But one longer article from the Savannah Morning News provided additional context that made her blood run cold. The article, dated September 20th, 1863, was headlined, "Local Pastor Departs Amid Concerns About Supernatural Occurrences." It described several incidents that had troubled Savannah's religious community in the months leading up to Morrison's departure. Congregation members had reported seeing a pale child in the church during services, though no children matching his description belonged to any of the families present. The child was always observed sitting alone in the back pew, following the service with apparent understanding, despite never speaking or interacting with other attendees. More disturbing were the reports of the child's appearances in Bonaventure Cemetery, where visitors had encountered him, sitting among the graves at all hours of the day and night. When approached, he would engage in conversation about the deceased buried nearby, displaying knowledge of their lives and deaths that no living person could possess. Groundskeepers had repeatedly tried to determine how he was accessing the cemetery's secured grounds, but their investigations yielded no answers. The article concluded with a statement from Bishop Hartwell, who had taken over Morrison's duties temporarily. "While we do not discount the sincere concerns of our congregation members, the Church must rely on faith and Scripture rather than speculation about unexplained phenomena. Reverend Morrison's departure is unrelated to these reported incidents, and we encourage all members to focus on their spiritual growth rather than pursuing matters that may distract from their relationship with God." Margaret could read between the lines of the bishop's careful statement. The church hierarchy was clearly aware of the situation, but had chosen to minimize its significance publicly while dealing with it privately. Morrison's abrupt departure suggested that their private efforts had been unsuccessful, leaving them no choice but to remove the problem by relocating the pastor who had become too closely involved. As she continued reading, Margaret discovered that the mysterious appearances had ceased abruptly in late September 1863, shortly after Morrison's departure and the creation of Elijah's daguerreotype. The timing suggested that somehow the photographic process had captured or contained whatever force was manifesting as the child. The final document in the collection was a letter from Bishop Hartwell to the Episcopal Diocese of Georgia, dated October 1863. In it he wrote, "The matter of the unusual child has been resolved through means that I cannot fully explain or endorse. Brother Josiah has employed techniques learned from his studies of photographic chemistry to create what he terms a spiritual binding. While I question the theological implications of such methods, I cannot argue with their effectiveness. The manifestations have ceased entirely, and our community can once again focus on the proper worship of our Lord." Margaret closed the file and sat in silence, absorbing the full implications of what she had discovered. The daguerreotype was not simply a portrait, but a prison, created through some combination of photographic chemistry and spiritual practice that had trapped Elijah's essence within the silver and glass medium. For 60 years, he had remained dormant within the image, until her purchase and examination had somehow weakened the binding that held him. As she packed up her research materials, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Several times she glanced around the reading room, expecting to see pale eyes observing her from the shadows between the stacks. The sensation followed her all the way to her car, where she sat for several minutes before starting the engine, trying to decide whether she was brave enough to return to her house and face whatever awaited her there. Margaret returned to her house on Jones Street as the afternoon heat reached its peak, the Spanish moss hanging motionless in the still air like funeral drapes. The familiar sight of her Victorian cottage should have been comforting, but instead it filled her with a dread that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. She sat in her car for several minutes, air conditioning running, steeling herself for what she might find inside. The front door stood exactly as she had left it, securely locked with no signs of disturbance. Yet as Margaret stepped across the threshold, she immediately sensed that something fundamental had changed during her absence. The air inside felt charged with electricity, like the oppressive atmosphere that preceded a violent thunderstorm. Every shadow seemed deeper, every corner more pronounced, as if the house itself had become more sharply defined while she was away. Margaret made her way cautiously to the dining room, her heart hammering against her ribs. The daguerreotype remained where she had left it on the table, but the space around it had been transformed. Books had been pulled from her shelves and arranged in careful stacks around the photograph, all open to pages dealing with death, spiritualism, or unexplained phenomena. Her laptop had been moved to face the daguerreotype directly, its screen displaying a search page for children who never lived, though she had no memory of entering such terms. More unsettling were the drawings scattered across the table's surface. Rendered in what appeared to be charcoal on pages torn from her research notebooks, they depicted scenes that Margaret recognized from her morning's archival work. There was Reverend Morrison fleeing Savannah in the dead of night, his face twisted with terror. Another showed Bonaventure Cemetery under moonlight, with a pale child sitting among the weathered headstones. A third portrayed the interior of a church, where congregation members recoiled in fear from a small figure in the back pew. The artwork was executed with a skill and attention to detail that spoke of professional training, yet the style belonged unmistakably to another era. Each drawing was signed in the lower right corner, with the initials EF written in a child's careful script. Margaret picked up one of the drawings with trembling hands, studying the technique and subject matter. The image showed her own dining room, but from the perspective of someone seated where the daguerreotype rested. She could see herself sleeping in her chair from the previous night, unaware of the pale figure standing beside her, one translucent hand reaching toward her face as if to touch her cheek. "You have been researching my history," came Elijah's voice from directly behind her, causing Margaret to drop the drawing and spin around. The child stood in the doorway, no longer confined to the daguerreotype, but manifesting as a three-dimensional presence in her home. He appeared exactly as he did in the photograph, dressed in his pristine white shirt and dark trousers, his colorless eyes reflecting a depth of knowledge that belonged to no ordinary child. Margaret's rational mind screamed that what she was seeing was impossible, but the evidence of her senses was overwhelming. Elijah Fox stood before her with a solidity that seemed to deny the supernatural nature of his existence. She could see the texture of his clothing, the way afternoon light from the windows fell across his pale features, even the slight rise and fall of his chest, as if he were breathing normally. "How are you here?" Margaret whispered. "You were trapped in the photograph." Elijah moved closer, his footsteps making no sound on the hardwood floor. "The binding that held me was weakened by your touch, your attention, your genuine curiosity about my nature. For 60 years I existed in a space between moments, conscious but unable to act. Your research has given me strength, and your acceptance of my reality has opened pathways that were long closed." Margaret backed against the table, feeling the edge press against her spine. "What do you want from me?" "Understanding," Elijah replied simply. "For so long I have been surrounded by fear and rejection. Reverend Morrison fled rather than accept what I represented. The photographer who created my prison did so out of terror rather than compassion. You are the first person to seek knowledge rather than simply wishing I would disappear." The child's expression softened slightly, and Margaret caught a glimpse of the profound loneliness that Reverend Morrison had described in his journals. Despite her fear, she felt a stirring of sympathy for this being who existed outside the normal boundaries of life and death. "Tell me what you are," Margaret said, finding her voice stronger than she had expected. "Help me understand how you can exist without having been born." Elijah moved to the window, gazing out at the Spanish moss-draped trees with an expression of deep melancholy. "I am what remains when love creates a soul but cannot provide it with flesh. My mother died carrying me, but her desperate desire for my existence was so powerful that it brought me into being despite the death of my physical form. I am consciousness without birth, love without life, need without the ability to be satisfied. The explanation sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with supernatural cold. She had encountered references to such phenomena in her folklore research, stories of spirits created by intense emotion at the moment of death. But those were always dismissed as primitive superstition, not documented reality. "Your mother," Margaret said slowly. "What was her name?" "Sarah Fox," Elijah replied. "She was barely 16 when she conceived me, and her family cast her out when her condition became apparent. She died alone in a charity ward, but her love for me was so fierce that it transcended death itself. I came into being in the moment of her passing, born of her final breath and her desperate wish that I might somehow live." Margaret felt tears pricking at her eyes as she contemplated the tragedy of Sarah Fox's brief life and the unnatural consequences of her maternal love. "Why did you appear in Savannah? Why did you seek out Reverend Morrison?" "I was drawn to places of faith and comfort," Elijah explained. "Churches, homes where families gathered, anywhere that love and hope might be found. I sought what I had never known, trying to understand what it meant to belong somewhere, to be wanted and cared for. But my very existence challenged people's understanding of God's plan, and they feared what they could not explain." The child turned from the window, fixing Margaret with his pale, ancient gaze. "I have spent 6 decades in isolation, thinking about the questions I raised in people's minds. If God allows souls to exist without birth, what does that say about the nature of divine will? If love can transcend death to create consciousness, where are the boundaries between life and death, between the spiritual and physical worlds?" Margaret found herself nodding despite her fear. These were the same questions that had driven Reverend Morrison from his pulpit, the theological implications that had shattered his faith. Elijah's existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of creation, soul, and divine order. "The binding that held me in the photograph is weakening rapidly now," Elijah continued. "Soon, I will be able to manifest for extended periods, to move freely through the world as I did in 1863. But I do not wish to repeat the fear and chaos of that time. I seek someone who can help me understand my purpose, my place in the order of creation." Margaret looked around her dining room, at the evidence of Elijah's growing power, and the clear indication that her life was becoming inextricably intertwined with his mystery. She thought about the historical records she had studied, the lives that had been disrupted by encounters with this impossible child. "What happens if I help you?" she asked. "What happens if I refuse?" Elijah's expression grew sad but determined. "If you help me, perhaps together we can find answers that eluded Reverend Morrison and Bishop Hartwell. If you refuse," he gestured toward the drawings scattered across her table, "I will continue to grow stronger, to seek understanding wherever I can find it. But without guidance, without someone who can bridge the gap between my nature and the world of the living, I fear the consequences may be as chaotic as they were in 1863. Margaret stared at the impossible child standing in her dining room, weighing the choice that would determine not only her future, but potentially the safety of everyone in Savannah. The rational part of her mind screamed that she should flee, follow Reverend Morrison's example, and remove herself from a situation that defied all logic and reason. But her historian's curiosity, her deep need to understand and document the truth, kept her rooted in place. Margaret stared at Elijah for several long moments, acutely aware that her next words would irrevocably alter the course of her life. The child waited patiently, his pale eyes holding an expression of hope, tempered by the resignation of someone who had faced rejection countless times before. Around them, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls were anticipating her decision. "I'll help you," Margaret said finally, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "But I need to understand exactly what that means. What are you asking me to do?" Relief flickered across Elijah's ethereal features, followed immediately by a gratitude so profound that Margaret felt her heart clench with unexpected emotion. "Thank you," he whispered. "You cannot know what your acceptance means to one who has known only fear and rejection." Elijah moved closer to the table, gesturing toward the scattered drawings and research materials. "I have been observing your work, learning about your methods of investigation and documentation. You seek truth through evidence and careful analysis, approaching mysteries with logic rather than superstition. These are precisely the qualities I need in an ally." Margaret picked up one of the charcoal drawings, studying the intricate detail and mature artistic technique. "You created these while I was away." "Drawing has been one of my few outlets during the decades of imprisonment," Elijah explained. When consciousness exists without physical form, the ability to create becomes a lifeline to sanity. I have had considerable time to develop my skills. The admission reminded Margaret of the profound isolation Elijah had endured, trapped within the daguerreotype, with nothing but his own thoughts for company. The idea of 60 years of conscious solitude was almost incomprehensible, and she began to understand the desperate hunger for connection that drove his actions. "What exactly do you need me to help you understand?" Margaret asked, settling into her chair despite the supernatural nature of the conversation. Elijah remained standing, his posture formal and precise, as if he were addressing a classroom. "I need to comprehend my purpose in the divine order, if indeed I have one. Why was I created through such unusual circumstances? Why do I exist in this liminal space between life and death? And most importantly, how can I find peace without causing the kind of disruption that occurred in 1863? Margaret nodded thoughtfully. These were questions that combined theology, philosophy, and empirical investigation in ways that appealed to her academic nature. "I think our first step should be to research your mother's history. If we can understand the specific circumstances of your creation, we might gain insight into your nature and purpose." "Sarah Fox," Elijah said softly. "I know very little about her beyond what I experienced in the moment of my creation. Her love, her desperation, her final wish that I might somehow exist despite the death of my physical form. But the details of her life, her family, the circumstances that led to her isolation, these remain mysteries to me." Margaret opened her laptop and began making notes. Sarah Fox died 1863, probably in childbirth, pregnant at 16, cast out by her family. We'll start with birth and death records, then expand to census data and church registrations. Savannah's archives are extensive, and if she died in a charity ward, there should be documentation. As Margaret worked, she became aware of changes in her environment that went beyond Elijah's physical presence. The temperature remained comfortable, despite the oppressive August heat outside, creating a pocket of perfect climate that seemed to emanate from wherever the child stood. The quality of light in the room had also shifted, becoming softer and more golden, as if filtered through stained glass windows that didn't exist. "Your manifestation affects physical reality," Margaret observed. "How extensive are these abilities?" Elijah looked around the room with an expression of mild surprise, as if he hadn't noticed the environmental changes he was creating. "I seem to unconsciously alter my surroundings to match my emotional state or needs. When I feel calm and hopeful as I do now, the space around me becomes more comfortable and welcoming. During periods of distress or longing, the effects can be more dramatic." Margaret thought about the extreme cold she had experienced during their first encounter, and the unsettling atmosphere that had pervaded her house since bringing home the daguerreotype. "Is that why Reverend Morrison found you so disturbing? Were you unconsciously creating an atmosphere of unease?" "Very likely," Elijah admitted with obvious regret. "I had no understanding of my abilities then, no control over how they manifested. My loneliness and confusion created an environment that reflected those emotions, making people uncomfortable in my presence, even when I meant no harm." The explanation provided another piece of the puzzle that had driven Morrison from his calling. Encountering a child who not only challenged theological understanding, but also created an atmosphere of supernatural dread would have been overwhelming for anyone, let alone a man whose faith was the foundation of his identity. Margaret continued her research, while Elijah wandered around the dining room, examining her collection of Civil War artifacts with obvious interest. His commentary revealed an intimate knowledge of the period that went far beyond what any child should possess. "This sword belonged to a Union officer," he said, pausing before a display case containing a ceremonial blade. "Captain James Mitchell of the 54th Massachusetts. He carried it during the assault on Fort Wagner, and it was with him when he died in the battery." Margaret looked up from her laptop, startled. "How could you possibly know that? The provenance documentation I have doesn't include that level of detail." Elijah's expression grew distant, as if he were looking through veils of time rather than at physical objects. "I can sense the history embedded in objects that have witnessed strong emotions. Death, particularly violent death, leaves traces that I can perceive. Captain Mitchell's final thoughts were of his family in Boston, and his fear that he would never see them again." The casual revelation of psychometric abilities added another layer to Elijah's mysterious nature. Margaret made additional notes, recognizing that she was documenting supernatural phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, perception, and the nature of reality itself. "Can you perceive the history of the daguerreotype itself?" she asked. "Do you know exactly how Josiah Hartwell created the binding that trapped you?" Elijah moved toward the photograph, but stopped several feet away, his expression becoming troubled. The process was complex, combining photographic chemistry with spiritual practices that Hartwell had learned from practitioners of various mystical traditions. He used silver from a communion chalice that had been blessed by 7 different religious leaders, and added compounds derived from herbs associated with binding and containment. But the key element was his own faith and intention to create a prison that would hold my essence indefinitely. Margaret studied the daguerreotype with new understanding. So it's not just a photograph, but a carefully constructed spiritual artifact designed specifically to contain you. Precisely. And the binding is weakening not just because of your attention, but because Hartwell is long dead and no longer maintaining the spiritual component of the trap. Without his continued intention to hold me, the silver and glass can only contain my essence for so long. The implication was clear. Regardless of Margaret's choice to help or flee, Elijah would soon be free to manifest in the physical world. Her decision to assist him was less about enabling his freedom and more about ensuring that freedom was used constructively rather than destructively. As evening approached, Margaret's research began yielding results. She found birth records for Sarah Fox, confirming her birth in 1847 to a family that had been prominent in Savannah's merchant class. The family's subsequent financial troubles and social decline provided context for their harsh reaction to their daughter's pregnancy. Most significantly, Margaret discovered Sarah's death certificate, which listed her place of death as the Savannah Poorhouse and Hospital. The document confirmed that she had died in childbirth and that her infant had been stillborn. But there was also a note in the margin, written in different handwriting. Unusual circumstances surrounding the death. Child's body never recovered for burial. Margaret showed the document to Elijah, who studied it with an expression of profound sadness. "She tried so hard to give me life," he said softly. "Her love was so powerful that it succeeded, just not in the way she intended." As darkness fell over Savannah, Margaret realized that she had committed herself to a path that would challenge everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the nature of existence. But for the first time since discovering the daguerreotype, she felt hopeful rather than afraid. Whatever mysteries lay ahead, she would face them with an ally who had waited 60 years for someone willing to seek truth rather than simply seeking escape. The next morning brought thunderclouds gathering over Savannah's historic district, their dark masses promising relief from the oppressive heat, but also carrying an ominous weight that seemed to mirror Margaret's growing sense of unease. She had spent a restless night, acutely aware of Elijah's presence moving through her house as he explored the physical world he had been denied for 6 decades. The sounds of his wandering were subtle but constant: footsteps on the stairs, the soft whisper of pages turning, the gentle closing of doors as he investigated each room with the wonder of a child experiencing everything for the first time. Margaret found him in her kitchen as dawn broke, standing motionless before the window that overlooked her small garden. He hadn't changed position for over an hour, seemingly transfixed by the simple sight of morning light playing across the leaves of her magnolia tree. When she entered the room, he turned with an expression of such profound joy that it took her breath away. "I had forgotten how beautiful mornings could be," he said simply. 60 years of existence without sunrise or sunset, without the changing qualities of natural light. Everything I experience now feels like a miracle. Margaret poured herself coffee, offering some to Elijah before remembering that he probably had no need for physical sustenance. To her surprise, he accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the aroma with obvious pleasure, even though he made no attempt to drink. "I cannot consume food or drink in the traditional sense," he explained, "but I can appreciate their essence, their emotional and sensory associations. This coffee represents comfort, routine, the gentle rituals that mark the beginning of each day. These experiences have immense value to someone who has been denied such simple pleasures." Margaret found herself moved by his obvious delight in experiences she had always taken for granted. The magnitude of his isolation became clearer with each innocent observation he made about the world around him. "Today we're going to visit the site where the poorhouse and hospital once stood," Margaret announced. "If we can locate the exact place where your mother died, you might be able to use your psychometric abilities to learn more about the circumstances of your creation." Elijah's expression grew serious, though his excitement about the physical world remained evident. I have often wondered about those final moments. What was she thinking? What were her exact words or feelings as she died? Understanding the precise nature of her wish might help us comprehend why I exist in this particular form. Margaret gathered her research materials and camera equipment, while Elijah wandered through her house, occasionally pausing to examine objects with the fascination of an archaeologist discovering artifacts from a lost civilization. His presence had become less unsettling overnight, though Margaret remained aware that she was sharing her home with a being whose very existence challenged the fundamental laws of nature. The drive to the former poorhouse location took them through Savannah's most historic neighborhoods, where antebellum mansions stood like monuments to a vanished way of life. Elijah pressed his face to the passenger window, drinking in every detail of the city he had known only as a supernatural observer for the past 60 years. "So much has changed," he murmured. "The streets I remember as dirt paths are now paved with brick. Houses that were simple wooden structures have been replaced by elaborate mansions, yet the essential character of Savannah remains unchanged, as if the city's spirit transcends its physical evolution." Margaret parked near what had once been the southeastern edge of the historic district, where the poorhouse and hospital had served Savannah's most desperate residents during the Civil War era. The original buildings had long since been demolished, replaced by a small park that few tourists visited. According to her research, the hospital had occupied the area near a cluster of ancient live oaks that still dominated the landscape. As they approached the trees, Margaret noticed immediate changes in the atmosphere around them. The oppressive heat of the August morning gave way to a cool, almost autumnal breeze that seemed to emanate from nowhere. The quality of light shifted subtly, taking on the golden tones she had observed in her dining room when Elijah manifested his presence. "This is the place," Elijah said with absolute certainty, moving toward the largest of the live oaks. "I can feel her presence here, faint but unmistakable, the echo of her final moments." Margaret set up her camera and notepad, prepared to document whatever Elijah might discover through his supernatural perceptions. She watched as he approached the tree with reverent care, his pale hands extended, as if to embrace its ancient trunk. The moment Elijah's fingers made contact with the bark, the change in atmosphere became dramatic. The park around them seemed to fade, becoming translucent and insubstantial. Through the ghostly overlay of the present, Margaret could see the past beginning to manifest with startling clarity. The simple park dissolved into the image of a sprawling wooden complex, its buildings weathered and overcrowded. The elegant live oaks remained, but they were younger, their canopy less extensive. And beneath their shade, Margaret could see a crude hospital ward where dozens of beds were crammed into spaces intended for half that number. "August 12, 1863, Elijah whispered, his voice taking on an otherworldly quality as he accessed memories embedded in the very earth beneath their feet. She had been in labor for 18 hours. The other women in the ward whispered that she was too young, too small, that neither she nor the child would survive the ordeal. The ghostly images became more defined as Elijah's connection to the location deepened. Margaret could see a young woman writhing on a narrow cot, her face contorted with pain and exhaustion. Even through the supernatural vision, Sarah Fox's beauty was evident, though it was ravaged by poverty, fear, and the physical trauma of her difficult labor. "She had no family present," Elijah continued, his voice heavy with inherited sorrow. "No husband to comfort her, no mother to hold her hand. The other patients avoided her, viewing her pregnancy as evidence of moral failing rather than tragedy. She faced death alone, with only her love for me to sustain her through the final hours." Margaret watched in fascination and horror as the past played out before them. She could see a middle-aged woman in a nurse's apron, moving between the beds, offering what comfort she could to patients who had nowhere else to turn. The nurse's expression when she approached Sarah's bed revealed her professional assessment that both mother and child were unlikely to survive. "Her name was Mary Callahan," Elijah said, somehow accessing details that no historical record could have preserved. "An Irish immigrant who had lost 3 children of her own to yellow fever. She recognized in my mother the same desperate love she had felt for her own babies, and she stayed by Sarah's side through those final hours." The spectral image of Sarah Fox grew more vivid as her labor reached its climax. Margaret could see the young woman's lips moving, though no sound crossed the barrier between past and present. But Elijah heard every word, and tears that seemed impossible for a supernatural being began streaming down his pale cheeks. "She knew she was dying," he whispered. "The pain was beyond endurance, and she could feel her strength failing with each contraction. But her thoughts were not of herself, only of me. She spoke to me as if I could hear her, telling me how much she loved me, how desperately she wanted me to live, even if she could not. Margaret felt her own eyes filling with tears as she witnessed the tragedy unfolding through Elijah's supernatural perception. The love between mother and unborn child was so palpable that it seemed to charge the very air around them with emotional intensity. Her final words, Elijah said, his voice breaking with emotion that transcended his ethereal nature. She said, "My darling boy, if love alone could give you life, then live, my sweet child. Live for both of us. Let my love be your breath, my heart be your heart, my soul be the spark that brings you into being. Live, Elijah, live even if I cannot." The ghostly hospital ward blazed with sudden light as Sarah Fox spoke her dying wish, and Margaret could see the moment when love transcended death to create something unprecedented in the natural order. The young woman's body went still, but her desperate desire for her child's existence created a kind of spiritual explosion that seemed to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. "That was the moment of my creation," Elijah said, removing his hands from the tree trunk and causing the visions to fade back into the present-day park. "Not birth, but creation through pure will and love. She died, wishing me into existence, and the universe somehow granted her request." Margaret stared at the empty space where the ghostly hospital had stood, struggling to process what she had witnessed. "The nurse, Mary Callahan, what happened to her? Did she see what occurred?" Elijah nodded slowly. "She saw everything. The light, the impossible moment when I first manifested beside my mother's body. Mary Callahan was the first person to witness my existence, and the terror in her eyes was something I carried with me through all the years that followed. She ran from the ward screaming about unholy miracles, and her testimony was part of what brought me to Reverend Morrison's attention." As they walked back to Margaret's car, she found herself grappling with the theological and philosophical implications of what Elijah had revealed. If love alone could create consciousness, what did that say about the nature of the soul, the boundaries between life and death, the very foundations of existence itself? "Now that you understand the exact circumstances of your creation," Margaret said as they drove away from the park, "do you have any insight into your purpose? Why were you brought into being in this particular way?" Elijah was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the passing cityscape with thoughtful concentration. Finally, he turned to Margaret with an expression of dawning comprehension. "I think I was created to prove something," he said slowly. "To demonstrate that love is a force powerful enough to transcend even death, to create life where none should be possible. But I was also created as a question, a challenge to conventional understanding about the nature of divine will and spiritual law. Perhaps my purpose is not to find answers, but to help others discover that the questions themselves are more important than any certainty they might have possessed before." That afternoon, Margaret threw herself into researching Mary Callahan with the intensity of someone seeking salvation through scholarship. If the Irish nurse had been the first witness to Elijah's supernatural creation, her testimony might provide crucial insights into the events of 1863 and their continuing implications. The rain that had been threatening all morning finally arrived, drumming against Margaret's windows with a persistence that matched her determination to uncover the truth. Elijah remained close by as she worked, sometimes offering suggestions based on his fragmented memories of the period, but more often simply observing her research methods with the fascination of someone learning to navigate the modern world. His presence had become strangely comforting, despite the impossible nature of their partnership. The archives revealed that Mary Callahan had indeed worked at the poorhouse and hospital during the Civil War years, arriving in Savannah as part of the wave of Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine. Unlike many of her contemporaries who found work in domestic service or factory labor, Mary had chosen nursing, driven by personal tragedy to dedicate her life to caring for others who suffered as she had suffered. Margaret discovered employment records showing that Mary had worked at the hospital from 1861 until late August 1863, when she had abruptly resigned her position. The resignation letter, preserved in the hospital's administrative files, was brief but revealing. "I can no longer continue in my duties due to witnessing events that have shaken my faith in the natural order of God's creation. I pray that I may find peace away from this place, where miracles and horrors walk hand in hand." More telling was a series of letters Mary had written to her sister in Boston during the weeks following Sarah Fox's death. Margaret found copies of these letters in a collection of Irish immigrant correspondence housed at the Georgia Historical Society, donated by family members decades later as part of a genealogical research project. The first letter, dated August 15, 1863, was nearly incoherent with distress. "Dearest Bridget, I write to you in a state of mind that borders on madness, having witnessed something that defies all understanding of God's plan for His creation. 3 nights ago, I attended the death of a young woman in childbirth, a tragedy common enough in our work. But what followed was neither common nor natural, and I fear my sanity may be forfeit for having seen it." Subsequent letters provided more detailed accounts, as Mary struggled to make sense of what she had experienced. Her description of the supernatural light that accompanied Sarah's death matched Elijah's own memories perfectly, but she also provided details that he had been unable to access through his psychometric abilities. "The child appeared beside his mother's body in the moment of her passing," Mary had written, "not born in any natural sense, but manifested as if summoned from some realm beyond our understanding. He was perfect in every detail, clothed and whole, with eyes that held knowledge no infant should possess. When he looked at me, I felt as if my very soul was being examined by a being older than time itself." Margaret read the passages aloud to Elijah, who listened with an expression of profound sadness. "She was terrified of me from the very beginning," he said softly. "I could sense her fear, but I didn't understand why my existence inspired such horror in those who witnessed it." Mary's subsequent letters revealed the psychological toll of her encounter with the supernatural. She described sleepless nights, haunted by visions of the impossible child, waking dreams where Elijah appeared in her room, seeking comfort that she was too frightened to provide. Her final letter from Savannah, dated August 28, 1863, showed a woman pushed to the edge of breakdown. "The child continues to appear to me at all hours, pleading for understanding that I cannot give. He speaks with the voice of innocence, but asks questions that challenge the very foundations of my faith. How can a soul exist without God's blessing? How can love create life outside the divine plan? I have consulted with priests and ministers, but they flee from my account, as if my very words carry contagion. I must leave this place before my reason abandons me entirely." Margaret discovered that Mary had indeed fled Savannah, taking a position at a hospital in Charleston, where she worked for several more years before disappearing from historical records entirely. But her letters to her sister continued sporadically, providing glimpses into her ongoing struggle to comprehend what she had witnessed. One letter from 1865 was particularly significant. In it, Mary described a meeting with a photographer named Josiah Hartwell, who had sought her out in Charleston specifically to discuss her encounter with Elijah. Hartwell had apparently been consulting with religious leaders and practitioners of various mystical traditions, seeking methods to contain or control the supernatural manifestations that were disrupting Savannah's spiritual community. Mr. Hartwell believes he has found a solution to the problem of the impossible child, Mary had written. He speaks of combining photographic processes with spiritual binding techniques learned from practitioners of ancient arts. His plan is to create a prison of silver and light that will hold the child's essence until such time as greater minds than ours can determine his proper place in God's creation. Margaret looked up from the letter to find Elijah standing by the window, his translucent form barely visible in the grey afternoon light. The rain had intensified, creating a curtain of water that obscured the world beyond the glass and seemed to isolate them from the normal flow of time and space. "Mary Callahan was instrumental in your capture," Margaret said gently. "She provided Hartwell with the details he needed to understand your nature and devise the binding that held you for 60 years. Elijah nodded without turning from the window. "I know. I could sense her involvement even from within the daguerreotype, but I do not blame her for her fear or her actions. She was confronted with something that challenged every assumption she held about reality, and she responded in the only way that seemed to offer protection for herself and others." Margaret found Mary's final letter in the collection, dated 1867, and written from a convent in North Carolina, where the former nurse had apparently taken religious vows. The letter revealed a woman who had found some measure of peace, but remained haunted by questions that would never be fully answered. "I have dedicated my remaining years to prayer and contemplation, seeking understanding of the divine plan that allowed me to witness such impossible things," Mary had written. The sisters here speak of mysteries beyond human comprehension, of God's wisdom, manifesting in ways that challenge our limited understanding. Perhaps the child I saw was not an abomination, but a revelation, a demonstration that love transcends even the boundaries of life and death. The letter concluded with words that sent a chill through Margaret. I pray daily for the soul of that impossible child, and I often wonder if his imprisonment was an act of mercy or cruelty. If love brought him into being, then perhaps only love can grant him the peace that has eluded him for so long. Margaret closed the file and sat in contemplative silence, absorbing the full implications of Mary Callahan's testimony. The nurse's account corroborated everything Elijah had revealed about his origins, while providing additional context about the fear and disruption his existence had caused in Savannah's religious community. Mary understood something that others missed, Elijah said, finally turning from the window to face Margaret. She recognized that my existence raised questions about the nature of divine love and the boundaries of creation. Her later letters suggest that she came to view me not as an abomination, but as a manifestation of God's infinite capacity for surprise. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. And Hartwell used her detailed observations to design a prison that would contain you until someone could be found who might understand your true nature and purpose. Which brings us to the present moment, Elijah said with a slight smile. You have proven capable of accepting my reality without fleeing in terror, and your research has provided insights that were unavailable to those who encountered me in 1863. Perhaps the timing of my release was not accidental, but part of a larger plan that has been unfolding for decades. As evening approached and the rain continued to fall, Margaret found herself contemplating the possibility that her discovery of the daguerreotype had been orchestrated by forces beyond her understanding. The connections between past and present, between Mary Callahan's witness and her own acceptance of Elijah's reality, seemed too precise to be mere coincidence. What happens now? Margaret asked. You're growing stronger each day, becoming more capable of sustained manifestation. What will you do with that freedom? Elijah moved closer to her workspace, his pale eyes reflecting the desk lamp's glow like mirrors of captured starlight. I want to complete the work that Mary Callahan began, he said quietly. She understood that my existence poses questions about the nature of love, death, and divine will. I want to help others discover those questions for themselves, not through fear and disruption, as happened in 1863, but through gentler revelation and gradual understanding. Margaret looked around her dining room at the evidence of their partnership scattered across her table and realized that her life had become inextricably intertwined with a mystery that stretched across decades and challenged the fundamental assumptions of human existence. But rather than feeling trapped or overwhelmed, she felt privileged to be part of something larger than herself, a story that was still being written and whose conclusion remained gloriously uncertain. Over the following days, Margaret's house on Jones Street became the epicenter of increasingly dramatic supernatural phenomena as Elijah's manifestation abilities continued to strengthen. What had begun as brief appearances and environmental fluctuations evolved into sustained alterations of physical reality that defied all conventional understanding of the natural world. Margaret woke each morning to find her dining room transformed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Books rearranged themselves into configurations that reflected Elijah's nocturnal researches, with volumes on theology, philosophy, and spiritualism positioned to create impromptu study areas. Fresh drawings appeared daily on her research table, each one depicting scenes from Civil War-era Savannah, with photographic accuracy and artistic skill that belonged to a master rather than a child. Most remarkably, Elijah had begun manifesting for extended periods during daylight hours, his form becoming increasingly solid and realistic with each passing day. By the end of the week, Margaret could no longer distinguish his appearance from that of any living child, except for the timeless wisdom that looked out through his pale eyes and the otherworldly grace with which he moved through her home. I can feel my connection to the physical world strengthening, Elijah explained as they shared breakfast on a humid Thursday morning. He sat across from Margaret at her small kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling untouched before him, while he studied the patterns of light and shadow cast by her Venetian blinds. Each day brings new sensations, new understanding of how matter and energy interact to create the reality that living beings take for granted. Margaret had grown accustomed to their morning conversations, finding them both enlightening and strangely domestic. Despite his supernatural origins, Elijah possessed the curiosity and wonder of any intelligent child, asking endless questions about the modern world while offering insights that reflected decades of observation and contemplation. "Are you learning to control your environmental effects?" Margaret asked, noting that the temperature in her kitchen remained comfortable despite the oppressive heat building outside. "To some degree," Elijah replied, extending his hand toward a wilted flower in a vase on the windowsill. As Margaret watched, the plant straightened and bloomed as if time were reversing around it, its petals unfurling to reveal colors more vibrant than any natural flower should possess. "I'm beginning to understand that my abilities are directly connected to my emotional state and conscious intention. When I focus on life and growth, I can encourage those qualities in my environment. When I feel sadness or longing, I unconsciously create atmospheres that reflect those emotions." The demonstration of his growing powers filled Margaret with both wonder and concern. If Elijah could manipulate physical reality with such apparent ease, what would happen as his abilities continued to develop? Would he eventually become too powerful for any human to safely interact with? "I've been thinking about our research and what we've discovered about your origins," Margaret said. "Carefully, your mother's dying wish created you, but perhaps it also established certain limitations or purposes that we don't yet understand. Have you considered that your growing abilities might have specific goals or boundaries?" Elijah's expression grew thoughtful as he considered her words. "I have wondered about that myself. Sarah Fox wished for me to live, but she also loved me deeply enough to desire my happiness and well-being. Perhaps the love that created me also embedded certain safeguards or directions that will become clearer as I grow stronger." Their philosophical discussion was interrupted by the doorbell, sending a spike of anxiety through Margaret's chest. She had been avoiding contact with neighbors and colleagues since Elijah's manifestation had become a constant presence in her home, uncertain how to explain the impossible child who shared her living space. Through the front window, Margaret could see Dr. Robert Chen, a colleague from the Georgia Historical Society, and Mrs. Chen's husband. His unannounced visit suggested either professional business or personal concern about her recent absence from the archives. "You should stay hidden," Margaret whispered to Elijah. "I'll handle this quickly and send him away." But Elijah shook his head with surprising firmness. "No more hiding," he said quietly. "If I am to fulfill whatever purpose brought me into being, I cannot remain a secret forever. Dr. Chen is a man of learning and open mind, according to your description. Perhaps he can offer perspective that will help us understand my nature." Margaret felt her heart racing as she approached the front door. Introducing Elijah to anyone else represented a massive escalation in the situation, potentially exposing her to accusations of mental instability or worse. But she also recognized the wisdom in his words. Their partnership had reached the limits of what two individuals could accomplish alone. Dr. Chen stood on her front porch, wearing the concerned expression of a friend who had noticed troubling changes in someone's behavior. His greeting was warm but tinged with worry. "Margaret, we've missed you at the archives this week. Mrs. Chen mentioned that you seemed distressed during your last visit, and I wanted to check on your well-being." Margaret invited him inside, her mind racing as she tried to determine how to introduce the impossible situation she now faced. Dr. Chen followed her toward the kitchen, making polite conversation about the oppressive heat and the latest additions to the Historical Society's collections. As they entered the kitchen, Dr. Chen stopped abruptly, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of Elijah sitting calmly at the breakfast table. The child looked up with a polite smile, rising from his chair with the formal manners of another era. "Dr. Chen," Elijah said in his cultured voice, "how pleasant to meet you. Margaret has spoken of your dedication to preserving and understanding the past. I believe we share similar interests in that regard." Dr. Chen stood frozen in the doorway, his academic mind struggling to process what his senses were reporting. Margaret could see the confusion and growing alarm in his expression as he tried to reconcile the presence of an unfamiliar child in her home with her established pattern of living alone. "Margaret," Dr. Chen said slowly, his voice carefully controlled, "would you mind introducing me to your young friend?" Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would irrevocably alter her relationship with the academic community and possibly her entire professional reputation. "Robert, this is Elijah Fox. He's connected to a research project I've been working on, a very unusual research project." Elijah stepped forward with graceful confidence, extending his hand in a gesture of formal greeting. "Dr. Chen, I hope you will forgive the unusual circumstances of our meeting. I am aware that my presence here raises many questions, and I would be honored to help provide some answers. Dr. Chen automatically took Elijah's offered hand, then jerked back in surprise. Margaret could see from his expression that he had felt something unexpected in that brief contact, some quality that marked Elijah as fundamentally different from any ordinary child. "His skin is cold," Dr. Chen murmured, staring at his own hand as if it had been burned. "And there was something else, a sensation I can't describe." Elijah nodded sympathetically. "Many people experience unusual sensations when they first encounter me. It is a natural response to contact with someone whose existence operates outside the normal boundaries of life and death." The matter-of-fact statement hung in the air, like a challenge to everything Dr. Chen understood about reality. Margaret watched her colleague struggle to maintain his rational worldview while confronting evidence that threatened to shatter it entirely. "Margaret," Dr. Chen said carefully, "I think we need to talk privately about what's happening here." But Elijah intervened before Margaret could respond. "Dr. Chen, with respect, I believe the conversation will be more productive if we dispense with attempts to explain away what you're experiencing. I am not an ordinary child, and this is not a situation that can be understood through conventional reasoning. But I am also not dangerous, and Margaret's association with me is both voluntary and beneficial to our mutual research goals." "Doctor." Chen sank into one of Margaret's kitchen chairs, his face pale with the effort of processing what he was hearing. "This is impossible," he said weakly. "Children don't speak like that, don't move like that, don't feel like that when you touch them." "You are correct on all counts," Elijah agreed gently. "I'm impossible by conventional standards, but impossibility does not negate existence, and my presence here offers opportunities for understanding that transcend the normal boundaries of historical research." Margaret moved to prepare coffee for Dr. Chen, hoping the familiar ritual would help ground him in some semblance of normalcy, while his worldview underwent radical reconstruction. She could see that he was struggling to maintain his composure, caught between the evidence of his senses and the rational skepticism that had guided his academic career. "Tell me what you are," Dr. Chen said finally, his voice hoarse with strain. "Because every instinct I possess is telling me that you're not human, at least not in any way I understand the term." Elijah smiled with the patience of someone who had waited decades for the opportunity to share his story with a receptive audience. "I am the product of love transcending death, consciousness created by a dying mother's desperate wish for her child's existence. I am Elijah Fox, born of Sarah Fox's final breath in 1863, and I have been waiting 60 years for someone with the wisdom and courage to help me understand my place in the divine order of creation." As Elijah began to recount his origins and the circumstances of his imprisonment within the daguerreotype, Margaret watched Dr. Chen's face cycle through disbelief, terror, fascination, and finally, grudging acceptance of the impossible truth he was being forced to confront. Dr. Chen remained in Margaret's kitchen for nearly 3 hours, alternating between intense questioning of Elijah and periods of stunned silence as he struggled to reconcile the impossible reality before him with his lifelong commitment to rational inquiry. Margaret watched her colleague undergo the same psychological transformation she had experienced, witnessing the methodical dismantling of certainties that had anchored his understanding of the world. Elijah proved to be a patient and articulate subject, answering Dr. Chen's increasingly sophisticated questions with the wisdom of someone who had spent decades contemplating the philosophical implications of his own existence. When Dr. Chen asked for proof of his supernatural nature, Elijah obliged by demonstrating his ability to manifest historical visions, recreating scenes from Civil War-era Savannah with such vivid detail that the kitchen seemed to transform into a window through time. "The theoretical implications are staggering," Dr. Chen muttered, frantically scribbling notes as Elijah described the mechanics of his consciousness existing independently of physical form. "If awareness can persist without biological substrate, if love can literally create souls, then everything we think we know about the nature of existence requires fundamental revision." Margaret served lunch while the two continued their extraordinary dialogue, marveling at how quickly Dr. Chen had moved from skepticism to scientific fascination. His academic training was serving him well, allowing him to approach Elijah's revelations as data to be analyzed rather than threats to be feared. "The question that troubles me most," Dr. Chen said as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the kitchen floor, is what your existence implies about the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds. If such phenomena are possible, why aren't they more common? Why don't we encounter beings like you regularly? Elijah considered the question with obvious seriousness. Perhaps because the specific conditions required for my creation are extraordinarily rare. Love powerful enough to transcend death, combined with circumstances that allow that love to manifest as conscious existence rather than simply lingering emotion. Most dying mothers, no matter how devoted, lack the precise combination of desperation, clarity of intention, and spiritual openness that characterize Sarah Fox's final moments. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully, and the cultural context of 1863 Savannah would have been particularly conducive to supernatural manifestations. The trauma of war, the heightened religious fervor, the general acceptance of mystical experiences as part of daily life. Modern skepticism might actually prevent such phenomena from occurring. Margaret found herself impressed by Dr. Chen's rapid adaptation to concepts that had taken her days to fully accept. His scholarly approach was providing insights that neither she nor Elijah had considered, viewing the supernatural through the lens of historical and cultural analysis. There's another factor we haven't discussed, Margaret added, the role of witness and documentation. Mary Callahan saw Elijah's creation, Reverend Morrison encountered him repeatedly, and ultimately Josiah Hartwell captured his essence in the daguerreotype. Perhaps supernatural phenomena require human observation and record-keeping to achieve lasting significance. Elijah's expression brightened with recognition. That's a profound insight. My existence became real in a meaningful sense only when others acknowledged and responded to it. The daguerreotype served not just as a prison, but as a form of validation, proof that I had existed and affected the world around me. Dr. Chen looked up from his notes with a troubled expression. Which brings us to the critical question of what happens next. Elijah, you're clearly growing stronger and more capable of sustained manifestation. But what are your intentions? What do you plan to do with this freedom you've regained? The question hung in the air with obvious weight, highlighting the uncertainty that had been building in Margaret's mind as she watched Elijah's abilities develop. His power to alter physical reality was expanding daily, and while he had shown no malicious intent, the potential for disruption remained significant. I have no desire to repeat the chaos of 1863, Elijah said firmly. My appearances then were driven by loneliness and confusion, and I had no understanding of how my presence affected others. Now, thanks to Margaret's research and your scholarly perspective, I have a clearer sense of my impact on the world around me. Dr. Chen leaned forward intently. But you must have goals, purposes you wish to fulfill. Consciousness doesn't exist without motivation, without desires or objectives that drive behavior. Elijah rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the Spanish moss-draped trees that lined Jones Street. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of longing that reminded Margaret powerfully of his origins as a child who had never known a mother's love. I want to understand the nature of love that created me, he said quietly. Not just my mother's love, but the divine love that allowed her wish to transcend death and create consciousness from pure will. I want to help others recognize that love is a force more powerful than they imagine, capable of achieving what seems impossible when it operates without limitation. Margaret felt her heart clench at the simple honesty of his response. Despite his supernatural abilities and otherworldly wisdom, Elijah remained fundamentally what he had always been, a child seeking understanding of the love that had brought him into being. Dr. Chen was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the implications of what he had heard. Finally, he turned to Margaret with an expression of grave concern. Margaret, I need to ask you directly, do you believe you're equipped to handle this situation on your own? The phenomena you're dealing with are unprecedented, and the potential consequences of mismanagement could be catastrophic. Margaret considered the question carefully. Over the past week, she had grown comfortable with Elijah's presence and confident in their partnership. But Dr. Chen's perspective reminded her that she was operating far outside her area of expertise, dealing with forces that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. I don't know, she admitted, but I also don't know who else is qualified to handle something like this. The religious leaders of 1863 fled rather than confront the questions Elijah represents. Modern science has no framework for understanding consciousness that exists without biological substrate. Who would you suggest I consult? Dr. Chen rubbed his temples, clearly struggling with the weight of responsibility that had suddenly descended upon him. This goes beyond individual expertise. We're dealing with phenomena that could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness, spirituality, and the nature of existence itself. The implications for theology, philosophy, and science are enormous. Elijah returned to the table, sensing the tension that had developed between his adult companions. Dr. Chen, I understand your concerns about the magnitude of what my existence represents, but please remember that I am not a force of nature or an abstract phenomenon. I am an individual consciousness, seeking understanding and purpose, just as you are. The questions I represent are important, but they don't require institutional management or academic committee oversight. Dr. Chen studied Elijah with an expression that mixed scholarly fascination with genuine worry. But what happens when others discover your existence? Word will spread eventually. People will want to study you, exploit you, or destroy you depending on their perspective. How do you propose to handle that level of attention? Margaret felt a chill of recognition as she contemplated Dr. Chen's warning. In her excitement about uncovering the truth of Elijah's origins, she had given little thought to the broader implications of his growing manifestation abilities. If his presence became widely known, it would indeed attract attention from countless individuals and institutions with agendas that might not align with Elijah's well-being or peaceful intentions. Perhaps the solution is to be selective about who we trust with this knowledge, Margaret suggested. Dr. Chen, you've proven capable of accepting Elijah's reality and approaching it with scholarly objectivity. There must be others in the academic and spiritual communities who could provide valuable perspective without creating chaos. Elijah nodded thoughtfully. I would welcome the opportunity to engage with others who can offer wisdom and understanding. 60 years of isolation have left me hungry for intellectual companionship and diverse perspectives on the questions my existence raises. Dr. Chen sighed deeply, clearly recognizing that he had been drawn into a situation that would irrevocably alter his own life and career. I'll need time to consider how to proceed. This goes against everything I've been trained to believe about the nature of reality, but I can't deny the evidence of my own senses. As evening approached and Dr. Chen prepared to leave, he turned to Margaret with a final warning that sent ice through her veins. Be very careful, Margaret. What you're dealing with here is unprecedented in human history. There are no established protocols, no guidelines for managing contact with a being like Elijah. One mistake, one misunderstanding, and the consequences could extend far beyond this house on Jones Street. The weekend brought unexpected visitors to Margaret's house, as Dr. Chen's carefully worded phone calls resulted in the arrival of 3 additional scholars who had been sworn to secrecy regarding the nature of their consultation. Margaret watched through her front window as a small academic delegation approached her door. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a professor of religious studies from Emory University, Dr. James Patterson, a philosopher specializing in consciousness studies from the University of Georgia, and Dr. Sarah Williams, a psychologist with expertise in anomalous phenomena. Elijah had spent the morning preparing for the encounter with the focused intensity of someone who understood that his future might depend on the impressions he made. He had dressed in his formal white shirt and dark trousers, his appearance now so solid and lifelike that Margaret sometimes forgot about his supernatural origins until she caught sight of his otherworldly eyes. "Are you nervous?" Margaret asked as they waited for the doorbell to ring. "Profoundly," Elijah admitted with disarming honesty. "These scholars represent the first opportunity I've had to engage with multiple academic perspectives simultaneously. Their acceptance or rejection of my reality could determine whether I find the understanding I seek or face another century of isolation." Margaret squeezed his shoulder reassuringly, noting that his form felt completely solid beneath her touch. His manifestation abilities had stabilized over the past few days, allowing him to maintain physical presence for extended periods without visible effort. Dr. Chen arrived first, followed shortly by his carefully selected colleagues. Margaret could see the mixture of skepticism and curiosity in their expressions as she invited them into her living room, where Elijah waited with the patient dignity that had characterized his interactions with Dr. Chen. Dr. Vasquez, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and intelligent dark eyes, was the first to speak after introductions were completed. "Dr. Chen has shared some rather extraordinary claims about the nature of your existence, young man. I hope you'll forgive our skepticism, but we've all built our careers on the foundation of rational inquiry." Elijah inclined his head respectfully. "Dr. Vasquez, I would be disappointed if you accepted my reality without thorough investigation. Skepticism is the appropriate response to claims that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence. Dr. Patterson, a lean man in his 50s, with the intense gaze of someone accustomed to wrestling with abstract concepts, leaned forward in his chair. Dr. Chen mentioned that you claim to be consciousness without biological substrate. If that's true, it would revolutionize our understanding of the mind-body problem that has puzzled philosophers for centuries. Indeed, Elijah replied, my existence suggests that consciousness can arise and persist independently of neural activity, supported instead by the force of love and intention that brought me into being. I offer myself as a case study in the possibility that awareness transcends the physical limitations we normally consider absolute. Dr. Williams, a younger woman with short blonde hair and the careful demeanor of someone trained to evaluate psychological anomalies, was taking detailed notes as she observed Elijah's behavior and speech patterns. Your verbal sophistication and emotional maturity are inconsistent with your apparent physical age. Can you explain this discrepancy? Elijah smiled with obvious appreciation for her directness. Dr. Williams, I have existed for over 60 years, though most of that time was spent in a state of conscious observation without physical interaction. My apparent youth reflects the age at which I was created, but my mental development has continued throughout my imprisonment within the daguerreotype. Margaret watched the scholars' faces as they processed Elijah's responses, seeing the same progression from disbelief to fascination that she and Dr. Chen had experienced. But she also noticed something else, a growing sense of excitement as the academic implications of Elijah's existence became clear to each specialist in their respective fields. Would you be willing to demonstrate some of your anomalous abilities? Dr. Patterson asked. Physical manifestations that would be impossible for any ordinary individual? Elijah looked to Margaret for permission, receiving her encouraging nod before rising from his chair. He moved to a potted plant that had been wilting in the corner of the room, placing his hands gently on its drooping leaves. The scholars watched in stunned silence as the plant straightened and bloomed with unnatural vitality, its flowers shifting through colors that had no earthly equivalent. But the real demonstration came when Elijah turned his attention to the room's atmosphere itself. The late afternoon light streaming through Margaret's windows began to change quality, becoming softer and more golden despite the unchanged position of the sun. The temperature dropped to a perfect, comfortable level, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with an energy that made everyone present feel more alert and focused. How are you doing this? Dr. Vasquez whispered, her voice filled with awe. I'm not entirely certain myself, Elijah admitted. My abilities seem to respond to my emotional state and conscious intention, but the mechanisms involved operate beyond my complete understanding. I can influence matter and energy in ways that parallel my inner experience, but I cannot fully explain the process. Dr. Patterson was frantically scribbling notes, his philosophical training providing him with frameworks for analyzing what he was witnessing. This suggests that consciousness possesses properties we've never recognized, capabilities that extend far beyond simple awareness and cognition. If you can alter physical reality through intention alone, then mind and matter are far more intimately connected than any current theory suggests. Dr. Williams was studying Elijah with the intense focus of someone trying to detect signs of fraud or psychological disturbance. I'm seeing no indicators of deception or mental illness, she said slowly. Your behavior patterns, speech rhythms, and emotional responses are consistent with someone telling the truth about genuinely extraordinary experiences. Dr. Vasquez had remained largely silent during the demonstrations, but Margaret could see her wrestling with profound theological implications. Finally, she spoke with the careful precision of someone whose faith was being challenged and expanded simultaneously. If you are indeed what you claim to be, then you represent a manifestation of divine love that transcends our understanding of natural law. The creation of consciousness through a dying mother's wish suggests that God's power operates through love in ways that exceed the boundaries of conventional religious doctrine. Elijah's expression grew deeply moved by her statement. Dr. Vasquez, that interpretation offers me hope that my existence serves a purpose beyond mere anomaly. If I am indeed a manifestation of divine love, then perhaps my role is to help others recognize the unlimited potential of love to transcend even death itself. The afternoon progressed with increasingly sophisticated discussions as each scholar engaged with Elijah from their particular area of expertise. Dr. Patterson explored the philosophical implications of consciousness existing independently of brain function. Dr. Williams investigated the psychological mechanisms that might govern Elijah's emotional development and social adaptation. Dr. Vasquez examined the theological questions raised by a being created through spiritual rather than biological processes, but it was Dr. Chen who raised the question that had been weighing on Margaret's mind since Dr. Chen's warning the previous day. Elijah, we need to discuss the practical implications of your growing abilities and our expanding knowledge of your nature. Word of your existence will eventually spread beyond this small circle. How do you propose to handle the attention that will inevitably follow? Elijah had been quiet for several minutes, apparently contemplating the same concerns. I've been thinking about that question extensively. My appearance in 1863 created chaos, partly because I had no guidance or support from those who understood my nature. But now I have allies who can help me navigate the complexities of existence in the modern world. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward intently. What exactly are you proposing? I want to reveal myself gradually, working with trusted scholars and spiritual leaders to share my story and the insights it offers about the nature of love, consciousness, and divine possibility. Rather than hiding until I'm accidentally discovered, I prefer to control the narrative and ensure that my existence is understood in constructive rather than threatening terms. Margaret felt both admiration and terror at Elijah's proposal. The courage required to voluntarily expose himself to a world that might react with fear or exploitation was enormous, but she also recognized the wisdom in taking control of a situation that would inevitably become public knowledge. The risks are substantial, Dr. Williams warned. Religious extremists might view you as either divine or demonic, depending on their theological perspective. Scientists will want to study you as a laboratory specimen. Government agencies might seek to exploit or contain you. Elijah nodded solemnly. All of these dangers are real and significant. But the alternative is to remain hidden indefinitely, denying the world the opportunity to learn from my existence and grow in understanding of love's true power. I did not transcend death and endure 60 years of imprisonment simply to hide in Margaret's house for the rest of eternity. As evening approached and the scholars prepared to leave, Margaret realized that a crucial threshold had been crossed. Elijah's existence was no longer a secret, shared by two individuals, but the beginning of what might become a transformation in humanity's understanding of life, death, and the fundamental nature of existence itself. The question was no longer whether Elijah would reveal himself to the world, but how that revelation could be managed to maximize understanding while minimizing the chaos that had characterized his previous emergence into public awareness. 3 weeks had passed since the gathering of scholars in Margaret's living room, and the small circle of trusted allies had expanded to include carefully vetted theologians, philosophers, and researchers from institutions across the Southeast. Each new encounter strengthened Elijah's confidence and refined his understanding of how his existence might be revealed to the broader world without creating the chaos that had characterized his emergence in 1863. Margaret's house had become an informal research center with rotating visits from academics who came to study, question, and ultimately accept the reality of consciousness created through love's transcendence of death. Elijah proved to be an ideal subject for their investigations, patient with repeated questioning and generous with demonstrations of his abilities while maintaining clear boundaries about his privacy and autonomy. The most significant development had been Elijah's growing mastery of his manifestation abilities. He could now maintain solid physical form indefinitely, alter environmental conditions with precision rather than unconscious emission, and even extend his influence beyond Margaret's property to affect small areas of the surrounding neighborhood. The Spanish moss on Jones Street had begun blooming with flowers that botanists couldn't identify, and residents reported unusual feelings of peace and contentment when walking past Margaret's Victorian cottage. On a humid Thursday morning, as thunderclouds gathered over Savannah's historic district, Elijah made the announcement that Margaret had been both anticipating and dreading. "It's time," he said simply, standing by the dining room window where he had spent so many hours contemplating the world beyond the glass. "I can no longer justify remaining hidden when I have the opportunity to share what I've learned about love's power to transcend the boundaries between life and death." Margaret looked up from her laptop, where she had been documenting the latest round of scholarly interviews. Over the past month, she had compiled hundreds of pages of testimony from academics who had encountered Elijah, creating what amounted to the most comprehensive supernatural case study in recorded history. "How do you want to proceed?" she asked, though she suspected he had already developed a detailed plan. Elijah turned from the window with an expression of calm determination. "Dr. Vasquez has arranged for me to address a small gathering at Emory University's theology department. Faculty members from several institutions will be present, along with select graduate students who have been researching consciousness and spirituality. It will be a controlled environment with people prepared for extraordinary claims." Margaret felt her stomach clench with anxiety. "And after that, Dr. Patterson has connections with philosophical journals that might be willing to publish peer-reviewed papers about my existence and its implications. Dr. Williams has colleagues in psychology who study anomalous phenomena. We proceed gradually, building credibility within academic circles before approaching broader audiences." The plan was logical and carefully considered, but Margaret couldn't shake her fear about the potential consequences. Once Elijah's existence became known beyond their small circle of trusted allies, there would be no controlling how the information spread or how various individuals and institutions might react. "What about the daguerreotype?" Margaret asked. "It's still the only physical proof of your origins and the binding that held you for 60 years. Elijah's expression grew thoughtful. "I've been considering that question extensively. The daguerreotype represents both my prison and my salvation, the artifact that preserved my existence when I might otherwise have faded into nothingness. I think it should be donated to an institution that can preserve and study it properly." Margaret nodded, understanding the symbolic importance of releasing the object that had contained him. The Georgia Historical Society would be appropriate. They have the resources to maintain it and the expertise to understand its historical significance. Over the following days, preparations for Elijah's first public appearance proceeded with meticulous care. Dr. Vasquez coordinated with her colleagues to ensure that the gathering would include only individuals capable of approaching extraordinary claims with open minds and scholarly objectivity. Security arrangements were minimal but thoughtful, designed to protect Elijah's privacy while allowing for genuine academic exchange. Margaret accompanied Elijah to Emory University on the appointed evening, her nerves stretched tight with anticipation and worry. The theology department's conference room had been arranged to accommodate approximately 30 faculty members and graduate students, all of whom had been briefed about the unusual nature of the presentation they were about to witness. Dr. Vasquez introduced Elijah with carefully chosen words that prepared the audience without revealing the full scope of what they were about to encounter. "Tonight, we have the privilege of meeting an individual whose existence challenges our understanding of consciousness, spirituality, and the boundaries between life and death. I ask that you approach this encounter with the same openness to evidence that guides all genuine scholarly inquiry." Elijah took the podium with graceful confidence, his pale eyes scanning the assembled academics with an expression of hopeful anticipation. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the room, commanding attention through its unusual combination of childlike innocence and ancient wisdom. "Distinguished faculty and students, I am Elijah Fox, and I exist because love transcended death in a charity hospital ward in 1863. My mother, Sarah Fox, died wishing me into being with such powerful intention that consciousness emerged from pure will and maternal devotion. I have spent 60 years imprisoned within a daguerreotype, contemplating the questions my existence raises about the nature of divine love and the boundaries of creation itself." The room fell silent as Elijah's words settled into the minds of listeners who had expected academic discussion but were confronting direct testimony about supernatural phenomena. Margaret watched faces throughout the audience, seeing the familiar progression from skepticism to fascination as Elijah began to demonstrate his abilities. He started simply, altering the room's lighting to create a warm, golden atmosphere that made everyone present feel more alert and comfortable. Then he moved to more dramatic demonstrations, manifesting brief visions of Civil War-era Savannah that appeared as translucent overlays on the contemporary conference room. But the most powerful moment came when Elijah shared his psychometric reading of the building itself, revealing details about the lives and deaths of patients who had been treated in the university hospital decades earlier. His specific knowledge of events that no living person could remember provided evidence that his abilities extended far beyond simple theatrics or psychological manipulation. "I offer myself to you not as an object of study, but as a partner in understanding," Elijah concluded his presentation. "My existence proves that love is a force more powerful than we have dared to imagine, capable of creating consciousness from pure intention and transcending the boundaries that normally separate life from death. The questions I represent are important, not because I am unique, but because I am evidence of possibilities that exist for all human consciousness when love operates without limitation." The question and answer session that followed lasted nearly 3 hours, with scholars from various disciplines engaging Elijah in discussions that ranged from technical inquiries about his manifestation abilities to profound theological debates about the nature of divine intervention in the natural world. Throughout it all, Elijah maintained his patient dignity, answering each question with honesty about both his knowledge and the mysteries that remained beyond his understanding. As the evening concluded and faculty members began to leave, Margaret could see that something fundamental had shifted in the room's atmosphere. Scholarly skepticism had given way to genuine excitement about the implications of what they had witnessed. Several professors approached Elijah with offers to collaborate on research projects, while others requested permission to share his story with colleagues at other institutions. Dr. Patterson pulled Margaret aside as the conference room emptied. "This is going to change everything," he said quietly. "Once word of tonight spreads through academic networks, there will be no containing the implications." Elijah's existence challenges fundamental assumptions in every field from neuroscience to theology. Margaret nodded, feeling both exhilarated and terrified by the magnitude of what had been set in motion. "Is he ready for that level of attention? Are we ready to help him navigate it?" Dr. Patterson studied Elijah, who was engaged in earnest conversation with a group of graduate students. "He's as ready as anyone could be for something unprecedented in human history. But the real question is whether the world is ready for him." As they prepared to leave the university, Elijah turned to Margaret with an expression of profound gratitude and quiet triumph. "Thank you," he said simply. "For the first time since my creation, I feel that my existence serves a purpose larger than my own need for understanding. Tonight was not just my revelation to the world, but the beginning of the world's revelation to itself about the unlimited potential of love." Margaret looked at the impossible child who had transformed her life and challenged everything she thought she knew about the nature of existence. Whatever came next, whatever chaos or wonder Elijah's public emergence might bring, she knew that she had been privileged to witness the beginning of a new chapter in humanity's understanding of consciousness, love, and the boundaries between life and death. The daguerreotype in her dining room would soon be donated to the Georgia Historical Society, its 6-decade mission of preservation complete. But the consciousness it had protected was now free to pursue its true purpose, demonstrating to the world that love is indeed powerful enough to transcend even death itself, creating possibilities that exceed the boundaries of everything previously thought possible. As they drove home through Savannah's moss-draped streets, Margaret realized that their story was not ending, but beginning, with implications that would ripple through academic, spiritual, and philosophical communities for generations to come. Elijah Fox, the impossible child born of love's triumph over death, was no longer a secret, but a revelation whose time had finally arrived.